Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Biko M. Gray and Stephen C. Finley discuss the changing meaning of evil in theological thought and its intersection with the invention of race.
Straightforwardly, you knew what it was. It was, according to someone like Augustine, it was actually the lack of being, the privation of being, right? It was this, and it was real in the sense of it was something that you could understand as beyond reason, something that exceeded your capacity to pretty much reason about it in the same way that God exceeds reason. And miracles, mysteries, all of those things. You see this reality of evil being understood in a metaphysical way. This will be extended through the medieval folks like Thomas Aquinas. You'll see a little bit more of this as we move forward, but there's a massive shift that happens. I think, this is my reading of the history of evil. There's a massive shift that happens, I think, in the Second World War period, when Germany decides to do what it does, to enact genocidal Holocaust. And in very real ways, this particular framing of evil, this old school frame of evil as maybe the metaphysical privation of being, in other words, something like lack, or if you want to talk in sort of basic Christian terms, like the devil, or like these types of things, that understanding of evil starts to fall away because Germany is understood intellectually as the culmination of human progress throughout the history of philosophy. But what do you do when Germans, in their heyday of scientific progress, what do you do when they enact nothing other than a level of mass death on a scale we had not seen before? Right? How do we begin to think about this? And so now we're no longer raising questions about angels and demons, questions about what evil is in terms of the privation of good. We are now asking questions in a very, very, very different way, we call it postmodern way, a question about what is the scope or the extent of, quite frankly, human depravity, right? And how do we begin to think through those particular things, right? How do we begin to make sense of that? And then the question ultimately becomes, well, what is evil? Now, I'd be remiss here. I was actually doing some research. You all will forgive me for this side piece, this sort of like detour. I'm working on Sojourner Truth right now. She's a Black feminist abolitionist in the United States. And I was rereading her narrative yesterday to sort of recheck historical sources. And you see in the abolitionist literature, you see the abolitionists calling slavery evil. Yeah. And it's striking to me, though, that when they use this word evil, at least for me, when they use this word evil, they're naming slavery as evil, but the slaveholders do not see it as evil. They do not understand chattel slavery as evil. As a matter of fact, anti-Blackness becomes the standard of the day. And so now you have these two massive, not to mention indigenous genocide, you have these three massive movements. The genocide of indigenous folks, the movement of chattel slavery, which is to say, in the extension of that through anti-Blackness, and the genocide that happens in the Second World War. You have all three of these things, and yet the folks who are enacting these things never claim that they themselves are evil. That's right. It poses a critical question for us. Yeah. This poses a critical question for how we might understand evil, how we might make sense of evil, because now it's no longer easily identified. It's no longer readily understood. It is something very, very, very different. Finley, you can hop in. I'll have some second, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I want to make one distinction here. What Biko is helping us here with is what some philosophers and theologians would call moral evil. They'll make a distinction between moral and natural evil, which today is going to be kind of problematic. So natural evil might be an earthquake that kills 100,000 people. or a hurricane or something like that. The distinction isn't really all that clear when we think about environmental issues, because now a lot of what would be called natural evil, say 19th century, are affected by the kind of disregard for the environment, the exploitation of the environment, climate change, and so on. But what we're largely talking about here, I just wanted the audience to know, is moral evil. But it's not the only category of evil. Natural evil is also an important category. At the same time, it's hard to make a distinction between those two categories nowadays because people are just fucking up the earth and causing the earth to do things that are affecting people, drought, hurricanes, and so on, and not even talking about things like fracking in the West through indigenous land and elsewhere. So there's not a clear distinction, but there is a distinction that's important for us here.
The only thing that I would add here, I'm so glad you actually took the thought out of my head, Finley, making this distinction between moral and natural evil. Is that distinction, I think I just want to reinforce this point, that in the 19th and the 18th centuries, natural evil and moral evil were two very, very clear and distinct, realities. Right? You could attribute natural evil to an earthquake, like in Lisbon, for example. You could attribute a natural evil to an earthquake or hurricane. This is actually where insurance companies get their sense of acts of God from, right? When you have something like that, right? That natural evil was very clearly something that was out of the control of human hands. Right. Moral evil, and this is the trickier one oftentimes, moral evil is the one where this is absolutely within the realm of human control, within the realm of our abilities. And it turns out that we are some pretty shitty creatures, right? And because we're shitty creatures, we have to develop an entirely new category for the way that we treat each other.
That's right.
This is why Augustine has these notions of original sin, so on and so forth, right? These sort of like questions that have been pervading, particularly the Christian tradition, for some time. The reality, though, is, and I think Finley's absolutely spot on here, what do you do in a 21st century context when now the natural environment is being subjected to Anthropocenic violence, right? The Anthropocene has completely ravaged the planet. And so now what was once moral evil is now falling under the purview. I mean, what was once natural evil is now falling under the purview of moral evil, right? That's the thing that I just wanted to add a little more just to riff off of you on that.
Sure, that's helpful. The only thing I'll add is that in my particular work, in African American religion, it mostly focuses on this category of moral evil. Black people are constantly thinking about a world in which they are the objects of white racial terror, right? And so that's the kind of work that I do in thinking about what is the meaning of existence, what is the nature of the world, who are we, all these important religious questions in the context of an anti-Black existence. And so that's where I enter largely this conversation, is through African-American religion, and in particular, my work on the Nation of Islam, where they have an interesting way of thinking about this by creating their own mythology, their own creation mythology, and so on, that tries to explain the nature of evil. And in particular, why Black people suffer so much.
The only thing I'm going to add here is I'm not going to go specifically into the Nation of Islam. Dr. Finley's an expert on that. What I will say, though, is in my area of the world, in terms of philosophy or Africana philosophy, or Black philosophy, religion, however you want to frame it, however you want to frame that situation, one of the things that we notice is Black folks are being understood as evil, which is to say, if we want to boil this down for the audience, and we can think about this in terms of contemporary discourses on terrorism, is an easy way of thinking about this, or contemporary discourse on terrorism, or discourse in political theology of enemies, so on and so forth. What we understand as with evil now, to be just sort of blunt about it, what we understand with evil now is that at the end of the day, when we're talking about evil, we're actually talking about something that, number one, exceeds human reason. It is something that we can't fathom, right? Monsters that are under the bed at night, the boogeyman who falls asleep, right? But also, we're also talking about something that, because it exceeds human reason, and this is weird when we're talking about moral evil, but it's actually the case, that because it exceeds human reason, that you can absolutely, at any time, always kill it. As a matter of fact, you are motivated to destroy evil at any time. Right here in the United States, the Marvel comics are an absolutely big deal. And we talked about this a little before. Like Thanos, Thanos needs to be murdered. He is, he is the absolute embodiment. Now, mind you, no one questions, except for maybe Helmut Zemo, no one questions the actual brutality that Captain America is doing across the globe. No one raises questions about Avengers Assemble, and this blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Aryan-looking motherfucker is able to, like, kill and destroy all what he wants to do. We don't ask questions about that, right? Yeah. Because the evil is Thanos.
That's right.
Right? And you're motivated to kill that. Now, think about that in relation to Black in the United States. Think about this in relation to the history of Black folks in the United States, and in the West more generally, but specifically in the United States where we are, and where my research is largely focused in terms of like area and period. When you think about what happens, Black folks were once incredibly useful as enslaved people, free labor. What happens when we're no longer useful in that way? People don't know what to do with us.
Yeah.
And ultimately, what do they decide? Well, these folks are lazy, they're violent, they're sexual, their penises are too large, their butts are too big. They will threaten the order of civilization. And so what must we do? We must contain and kill it. Lynch mobs. Think about in the early 21st century, all of the folks being murdered by police, people being called demons and devils and existential threats to public safety. All of these claims are claims about Black folks being evil. Yeah. And so I just wanted to add.
Sure. And because I know Biko's work, I just want to say that this is what Biko would call the theodicy of the West. I mean, a lot of your audience is going to be European. And for me, that really begins with the slave trade and colonialism, right? The European slave trade and colonialism, to put it in a broader context, without naming all the countries, of course. I mean, we know there were the Dutch and the English and the French and Portuguese and so on. But this is really kind of the logic, the racial logic of the West, is that ultimately, even though there are other people of color here who are colonized and so on, quintessential evil in the West is the Black, or what Frantz Fanon would call the Black.
And the only thing I'll add here in terms of that theodicy piece, I love that. Thank you for that. The theodicy piece for most folks, y'all have frozen a little bit. So for most folks, I hope we're back now. But what I would say is, for most folks, we think of evil as a way, at least in philosophy of religion, we think of evil as a way to prove God's existence, which is to say, if God is so amazing, why do people suffer so much? Yeah. Why do people, fall apart? Why do people die? Why is so much suffering and violence in the world? And ultimately, that theological question has become a social one. And the response to that question, if God is so amazing, why does suffering happen? Why is suffering so much? If that is the case, then what nation states have done, and you can see this, you forgive me for your audience, you can see this with Israel in particular right now, a justification of its own goodness in the face of a massive group of people. Well, at the end of the day, those Palestinians, those Gazans, those Hamas members, so on and so forth, they are evil. And the Theodician move here is the democratic, open, multicultural, quote unquote multicultural state that is Israel is protecting democracy in the West. And so in that regard, it is a Theodician statement to say, we have to kill these people. We've got to murder these folks. And for folks in the United States who know this too well, listen to any cop. Any police officer will say he reached into his waistband. She resisted arrest. And as soon as they make that move, we're now in the realm of theodicy because that person is evil. Right. That person needs to be put down.
And I know I said I was going to be finished with this question, but again, I just want to emphasize something that Biko said, is that theodicy in the West is always a justification of their own goodness. Even the violence against, bodies of color, whether they be Palestinian, African, Native American, is always a justification or a reinscription of the goodness of white people.
The sad reality here is that theodicy is an anti-Black enterprise. It is a white supremacist enterprise. And with that in mind, once you understand that, a lot of things begin to make a lot of sense when you look particularly at the West. So I'm just riding with Finley here.
So with regard to people's essential nature, what I think the question is asking, whether people are evil and whether they do evil. In my work in African-American religion, it's actually hard to make that distinction. For my work in the Nation of Islam, they created an entire mythology to try to explain it and to try to make sense of Black existence in the face of white racial terror, over the 400 years of Black existence in the West, and in particular in the United States. And so one of the ways that they tried to explain it is by collapsing that distinction. White people commit this kind of evil because it is their nature to do so. So there isn't this distinction, right? They do it because they have to, because they were made in this creative genetic process called grafting, which becomes the logic or the reason to explain why they're so violent, which is otherwise absurd. Like it makes no rational sense, to use Biko's language, otherwise. And so the Nation of Islam and other Black religious groups in the United States then have to recreate the cosmos, basically, through mythology in order to make the world coherent, in order to make it make sense, because otherwise it's totally absurd. And what does one do in an absurd world that is incoherent? One can't even live in that kind of world. One can't even navigate that kind of world. And so this becomes both the way of making the world coherent, but also explaining the logics of white violence, even though it's mythological. And by mythological, I'm not talking about it's false. I mean, it's true that white supremacist violence is anti-Black, first and foremost, but also anti-Asian, anti-Native American, anti-Latino. All this shows up in the mythology of the Nation of Islam. But what is also true is that there's no other community of people who do this kind of violence, especially against Black people, as Europeans have, against Native Americans and so on. And it becomes a way then of explaining this that allows them to live in the world, as challenging as that might still be. And so there isn't this distinction then between the evil one commits, at least when it comes to Europeans and white people, in general. There's no distinction between the evil they commit and people being evil by nature. And how would that make sense anyway, right? Evil is always embodied when we're talking about moral evil, right? And so it collapses that distinction. It doesn't make sense in the way they try to frame it to make sense of the world.
I'm gonna hop in here. So I know that if I'm sticking out, I apologize for that. But what's so striking to me is it's also the other way around. Finley was getting at this from the perspective of the Nation of Islam. But when it comes to contemporary political theological discourses on evil, what ultimately emerges is that there is no distinction between the doing and the being too. We want that, right? What happens though discursively is that what is a doing becomes part of the being. Let me bring this down to a very, very basic level. Think about, and I'm thinking about this in large part because Israel and Gaza is on my mind. We've like Muslim, which is to say a set of practices, a tradition, a set of rituals that one enacts, right? The practice of Islam, right, is something one does, right? It is. You do salat 5 times a day. You go to Jama'ah every Friday. I'm talking about Sunni Islam. I'm not necessarily talking about the nation, although the nation incorporates some of these practices too. But it's something you do. And now, if you pay attention to contemporary discourses in the West, what one does has become who one is. So Muslim and Hamas are now the same thing. And both of those things mean evil. Both of those things mean evil. Think about this in relation to 9/11 in the United States. You see the same thing, that someone articulates themselves in relation to something they do, which is to say enacting a Muslim faith, and they do something that, yes, quite frankly, was terroristic. But what happens in the wake of 9/11? What happens? Now all Muslims, because what they do now becomes who they are, and who they are is evil.
That's right.
And so the one thing that I'm trying to articulate here is we would be better off if we paid attention to what we would call moral evil as moral evil, which is to say paying attention phenomenologically to what people do. The problem is, because of the way the West functions, it produces this categorical distinction for itself, which is to say for white folks, to be just kind of blunt about it, well, we're not evil. We sometimes do evil things, right? That's the distinction that holds until you deal with non-Western or non-white communities in the West. And then that distinction between doing and being falls apart, right? It doesn't matter what a Black person does when someone calls the cops on them. It is actually, no one's actually in, it doesn't matter what they did. You could be sleeping, you could be walking, you could be eating, you could be, like laying in your apartment. It doesn't matter. And it's this, and in this logical case, in this particular logic, the same thing happened in Gaza. We're seeing the same thing happen in Haiti. We're seeing the same things occur across the globe. That what these folks do is also is central to who and what they are as evil. I'll give you one more example and then I'll be done. In the history, and Finley, you can help me out with this.
Sure.
When Europeans encountered West Africans for the first time, there were a lot of things happening in Africa that were very different from what Europeans were doing, right? So West Africans were in tune, and still are in many cases, in tune with nature. And so they would quote unquote worship trees, or worship their ancestors, or worship whatever that whatever comes from their spiritual pathway. These things that they did eventually became bad religion, which is to say it eventually became evil.
Yeah.
And once it became evil to worship your ancestors, to venerate the people who have passed before you, it's a short step from that to this entire community of beings are evil. They are a threat to our existence.
Yeah.
To the way that we live. They are a threat to the way that we can move through the world. They bring chaos where order should be. And because of that, now doing and being have now become.
Well, let's think about that in terms of the US. And let's talk about crime, for example, and discourse on crime when it comes to Black people and people of color in general. Black people don't have the benefit of ecological explanations, these complicated explanations that explain certain, criminal behavior. We don't have discourse. We don't have recourse to poverty, lack of opportunities, oppression. Black people are just criminal because they are. Now they try to, and by they I mean white people in the United States, try to explain it. They try to get around that by saying it's culture rather than something more essential. But it still means that Black people, by their very nature, are criminal, where white people commit crime. I mean, that's a really important distinction. They have the benefit of these ecological factors, right? This and that and this other lead to crime. And so there's this complicated, array of factors that lead to it, but they're not criminals. But that's not the case with Black people and brown people in the US. Their very nature is to commit crime. And again, in the West and the United States, they try to be slick about it. Like they throw in terms like culture. But what they really mean is that this is just who Black people are. And you really see this when white people think nobody is looking or can identify them, such as in social media, or you look on an article that deals with somebody Black, and you go to the comments, which you should never do if you want to have a good day. You should never look at the comments. And you read the comments, and all the comments of these regular, ordinary people are attributing crime and violence to just being Black. Not to these other factors, not to these social, historical, economic factors, but just being Black. And so this is to support the point that Biko was just making. Evil then becomes an essential part of who Black people are. And again, I started with the flip side. The Nation of Islam's mythologizing this to try to explain white violence. Well, they look at that and they just fall apart because nobody's supposed to be thinking about why white people commit violence. I mean, that's just a real problem, or why white people do evil. That's just something you don't do. It's a given when you're talking about Arabs, Black people, Africans, Native Americans, and so on. But let's not talk about white people. Let's not put them under critical analysis. Let's not even mythologize that. Again, the response is that's just racist. So then, despite the fact that it's a bad definition of racism, that becomes the category then that even characterizes Black people's and other peoples of color attempt to describe white supremacy. All of those become racist too. So see, there are fail-safes built into the discourses here. While we can never really get at what is evil in the West, particularly when evil is embodied and enacted as white. It can't do it. And all of this is to preserve white goodness, even through all the violence, colonialism, racism, genocide in Palestine, and so on. Whiteness ultimately is good, and I know we're going to get to this, is always redeemable. Always.
It's a crucial point that Finley's harping on. I think if we can go full circle for a second and go back to Augustine, right? Or go back to that ancient time. People are wondering, why is violence, why is evil, why is suffering occurring in the world? And at that time, you could handle the fancy for was Manichaeism. You all, okay, I hope we're back. Yeah, the fancy term is Manichaeism. And Manichaeism is the sort of fancy term to say that on the one hand, God is the embodiment of all good, but the world is split between these two metaphysical realities of good and evil. The world is split in this binary way. And because it's split in this binary way, the job is for you to be on the right side of this binary, to be aligned with the side of good. Why am I bringing this up? And I don't know why it's sticking so bad, but why am I bringing this up? In large part because once the world is metaphysically split into this binary of good versus evil, the philosophical and political and socioeconomic and sociopolitical questions ultimately fall along these categories. So it's not simply, oh, me and Finley are railing against white people. As a matter of fact, I'm not actually really interested in white people specifically. I'm interested in the epistemic project that is whiteness, the project that produces these categories. And it just so happens that white people end up benefiting from the category of being on the good side of this good evil virus. Like, that's the main thing that I really just want to sort of emphasize.
And
this binary reality.
And the binary ends up racialized because white and black end up corresponding to this ancient distinction between light and darkness, and end up merging in that ancient distinction of light being good and darkness being bad. And that's how it becomes sort of embodied, racialized binary in the West. Because nobody is saying that everybody is good, Black people, Arab, or otherwise. I mean, there are no people who are just good, but we're talking about how evil gets deployed and understood, particularly in the West, right? Black people are always going to be evil, all right? They're always going to be on the dark side of that Manichaean divide. White people are always going to be good, no matter what they do, even if it's violent. They're always going to be able to be redeemed. They're always going to find ways to justify violence based on their own goodness, which is always presumed.
That's crucial, which produces, goes back to the Theodician question. That's the theodicy. Like, Fanon talks about this. Fanon is very clear about this, that what happens in the colonial context is that colonialism is a theodicy that justifies the goodness of the colonizers. We brought democracy to you fuckers.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? We brought running water to you pieces of shit in South Africa, right? This is how colonizers think. We produced all of this quote unquote civilization for you all. And so how dare you, evil, backward, primitive, dark, terrible beings, how dare you? How dare you act as if you're not the ones on the wrong side of the divide? We've given you a gift.
That's right.
And you're on the wrong side of this divide. So your job is to appreciate this and try to align yourself with the only sensibility, such that any modality of resistance in these colonial spaces is understood as evil. And Fanon's right about this. Colonized folks always got a knife in their back pocket, right? And it's not because they're trying to like, they want to kill, but it's always a moment where it's possible that I'm not willing to take this anymore. And you might call me evil. That's fine. That's totally okay. I'm gonna die either way.
Yeah, and I don't know that one can even cross that divide as a person of color, right? I mean, you're on the other side of this divide, this metaphysics of evil. I suppose that one, in very limited situations, can have that evil bracketed, but it's very tenuous.
It absolutely is. Fanon talks about the colonized scholar who decides they're going to get education from a good university, and they come back and they bring that civilization to the poor downtrodden colonized folks, and it turns out when colonialism decides that you're on the wrong side of the divide, you're going to still. And so I'm bringing all of this up in terms of good and evil, because there's nothing that the colonized, the dark, the black, there's nothing that any of these folks, the Arab, there's nothing that any of these folks can do to escape the metaphysical divide between good and evil. You asked about being and doing, and it's such a profound question. And once evil sticks to your being, everything you do is evil.
That's right.
It doesn't matter what you do.
That's right.
You can literally be, minding your business, watching birds, right? You can literally be sleeping in your apartment. And it doesn't matter what you do. You can be sleeping, you can be awake, you can sit in your car, you can't. Once evil has stuck, the game is over. You are subject to violence, if not death. And the weird part about it is, and this is the last thing to say about this particular point, the weird part about it is once evil sticks in this particular way, that's the theodicy. That in and of itself justifies the violence that happens.
Yeah.
Why do you suffer? Because you're evil.
Yeah.
Why are you poor? Because you can't get your shit together.
Yeah.
Why are you know what I mean? Like why can't you live? You know what I mean? Like, y'all know what I mean? Like, why can't you move up in the world? Because you're just a criminal. Why can't we so I share all of this to say that once evil sticks, it doesn't matter what you do. Tulsa, Oklahoma, that massacre that happened is another good example. But I bring all of this up just to say, once evil becomes attached to your being, everything you do becomes evil. So we have to think through those dynamics, especially in racialized and socio-political terms.
I'm not even sure I would be able to answer a question about true redemption, because I'm not sure what that means. I just know that in the West, whiteness is always redeemable. Again, even in the face of evil. And so part of this is discursive. Part of this is how we talk about evil and how we like things like slavery. You hear these narratives about the good and happy slave, for example, that are meant to deflect the evil of such a system. And at the same time, those narratives and discourses are always meant to redeem whiteness and to protect it from a charge of evil. Look at those slaves. They're dancing, they're happy. Look at them, they play music for us. I mean, this isn't evil. So you might start to glean the logic in that. We're not bad. Look at us. We're doing good by them. We're providing. Look, what was the narrative recently? Someone said Black people got all kinds of skills from slavery, job skills, and that kind of thing. Somebody in the United States said. That's just another example of how. There's the discursive aspect, this narrative aspect, I think I'll call it, that's always meant to justify whiteness and to protect it from the charge of evil, which means it's always possibly potentially redeemable and always good. So before Biko jumps in, I just want to say something about the term Holocaust. There have been multiple Holocausts. When I hear the term Holocaust, my response is also which one? Because long before the European Holocaust, slavery and lynchings were called Holocausts. And I just want to make that clear. We don't think, and part of this, of course, is also the logic that that says that evil against Black people is not as significant. Because we don't call that a Holocaust. We don't talk about Otto von Bismarck in Namibia or Cecil Rhodes in Southern Africa or King Leopold, who killed 15 million in the Congo. Those aren't holocausts, right? And maybe, you know, even though this was just a footnote, maybe this is also an important point. Evil is different, if it's evil at all, depending on who is the recipient of the violence, right? We don't refer to those. I mean, Leopold II is never a Hitler, but he killed 10, 15 million Africans over, you know, rubber plants and minerals, and at the same time. He's not considered, you know, this evil guy, even though the term Holocaust in the 19th century was first used to talk about slavery and lynching. So, I mean, how we talk about it depends on who we're talking about.
What I will add, I think Finley's points are incredibly prescient. What I will add here, just to give some context, right? I'm speaking slowly, one, because I'm freezing a lot, but also just because I want to make this point as clearly as I possibly can. Redemption is a commodity that is being exported across the West. What do I mean by that? The reason why Leopold II isn't understood as a Hitler-type figure is because the myth of redemption is something that can travel and be delivered from nation state to nation state. And perhaps the best producers, this is what's interesting to me, and maybe it's because I'm trained in American studies, perhaps the best exporter and producer of the narrative of redemption is the United States. We may not have been the first, right? Like the U.S. may not have been the first, but it's done a really good job of saying, yeah, we murdered and murdered indigenous folks, but we got them their own nations, their own reservations. Look at the BIA. We have redeemed ourselves. Yeah, we enslaved Black people and did a lot of lynching too. But look at what we've been able to do to overcome, right? Martin Luther King had a dream.
Yeah.
Right? And Barack Obama was the fulfillment of
you
that.
You read my mind.
Right? And so the United States has and this is a massive export. So when you look at Germany, what in many ways they've done, particularly with the Shoah, right? This particular Holocaust, what they've done is in many ways replicate a narrative of redemption and progress that we've seen elsewhere before. Right. Keep in mind, the Shoah happens in 39 to 45, right? People are getting lynched in the early 20th century. Right. And so what we see here is, and my point here in terms of redemption, and then I'm going to get to like what you call true redemption, because I think there's something there to that. I think it's such a crucial point. What we see here is what Germany wants to do and what Germany has done. And Fernando talks about this too, but what Germany has done is ultimately we did a bad thing. We acknowledge that we did a bad thing.
That's right.
Right? But we did a bad thing.
Correct.
Right? If you understand what I mean, it's not, and here we get back to doing versus being.
That's right.
Germany as a nation state, you got to keep in mind some of the thinkers that come out of Germany, right? So this is why I'm bringing up the difference between doing and being. Hegel and Heidegger are some horrible motherfuckers. Like, let's just call it. Right? And I read both of them, right? So it's not just, oh, we did a bad thing, right? Like, they're thinking. They're very epistemic horizons.
Yeah.
They're very intellectual development was organized around the idea of German chauvinism.
Yeah.
You think about the deployment of Nietzsche's sister, Nietzsche's deployment of his thinking on the overman, right? Again, this is not we did a bad thing. This is embedded in the intellectual and political climate of Germany. But the logic of redemption allows for you to sidestep those inherent developments and name the Shoah as something we did.
Yeah.
Right? This is something we did, and you know what we're going to do? We're going to advocate as hard as we can to produce another colonial state on top of, right, a group of people who are already there, so that we feel good in this national narrative of redemption. We fucked up. We did a lot of bad things. What we're really going to do, though, is we're going to produce a redemption narrative where we are now one of the greatest allies of another colonialist state, right? So that redemption arc, and we see this in the United States as well. You see a bit of this with Britain as well. And all of this is not so much about individuals. That's the one thing that I want to point out. These are national narratives embedded in people's memory. That redemption arc that you talked about now, that people need that as a way of stabilizing their sense of patriotism. You need to know that your country isn't as shitty as it might be.
And that's a mythology too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's embedded, quite frankly, in a particularly weird reading of the Christian tradition, though. That Jesus takes on the sins of the world and redeems everybody because we're fucked up, right? That there is something about that, and that myth, whether it be true or not, because the question of myths is not the historical fact value. Finley talks about this.
That's right.
Myths are stories we tell ourselves to make sense of how we live. That's what they are.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter. So I'm bringing all of this up to say, in terms of this redemption arc, national myths are stories to tell everyone who's part of these particular worlds that at the end of the day, you're not participating in something terrible. We're always getting better. We might have done some bad things. Now, when we talk about true redemption, and then Finley, I will defer to you here. I'm thinking about Fanon a lot here. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about what true redemption would actually take, and people don't really want to acknowledge this. What true redemption would actually take is nothing less than the destruction of the world as it's like.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to be like that, and I'm not even like, ooh, anarchy. I mean, like, you have to burn down the entire, like, horizons of our thinking and completely reconceptualize very basic ideas and terms. I'll give you a few of them. Human.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Finley. You can go.
No, I wasn't going to say anything. I want you to. I mean, you read my mind on a lot of this, and so I want you to continue. But this point about needing a new world is the destruction of one world, and needing a new world is the most important point, because this world can't deliver what one might understand as true redemption. It just can't do it.
There's no. I don't know how to say it any other way, right? Like these sort of foundational, just riffing these foundational concepts that we think are either presumed or presumed good. Like, what is a human? Like, that question is not, we don't interrogate it. Well, Palestinians are being dehumanized. Black people are being dehumanized. And my question always is the human actually a good thing? Is the human actually something that we want to participate in, right? This is what I mean by, like, destruction of the world, destruction of some of our epistemic foundations, including the concept of civilization. Seriously, no, literally, because that's a violent concept. I mean, it doesn't show up until either 1700s or 17th century, I forget. But when it shows up, it's describing France and England, and it's violent, and it only includes them, by the way. So this grammar that Biko is talking about, I mean, it's embedded in everything across the West. We need a new grammar. We need nothing short of a new world if true redemption is going to be possible. And the only thing that I'm just riffing off just specific parts of that grammar. Civilization is a great one, Finley, a fantastic one. Progress is another one. It is. Progress is another very good. Like, we think of human civilized progress. These three things we assume are either good or neutral. right?
Yeah.
And they're not. And if redemption is to happen, we need a wholesale deconstruction of these terms, if not a wholesale destruction of their intellectual edifice, to open up new modes of thinking. What if we understood ourselves? This is me just riffing here off of a scholar named Beatrice Maravich. What if instead of human, we understood ourselves as mortals, as beings who can die? What do you do? What if we shifted from human versus non-human to we can die, right? How do we think, how might that shift our epistemic horizons? And quite frankly, how might that shift the way that we engage, right? What if, so I'm bringing these up just to say, to speak to the question of redemption. On the one hand, nation states are constantly producing narratives of redemptions for themselves. They are largely white supremacist narratives, for sure, which means that those who are not embedded in, those who are not white, can never find redemption, not full redemption anyway, in these frameworks. Africa can never find redemption. Yeah. I mean, there's no way around. Africa will never be a redeemed continent in relation, no matter how many natural resources it produces for the world. We have to keep in mind, the Democratic Republic of Congo is on fire right now. People are being displaced and murdered, and no one gives a shit because there's no space for redemption. None.
That's right.
None. Right? There's no we need your cobalt. We don't. You don't get to be redeemed. Right? That's not. You know what I mean? Like you already know.
And we have a right to take it too.
Yes. Because you're irredeemable.
Right.
Fuck you mean? Fuck you mean you gonna sit up here and fight back?
Right.
We need your cobalt. We need your cobalt. So I bring this up just to say, on the one hand, you have a logic where nation states, particularly in the West, need these narratives of redemption, these myths of redemption, these redemption myths to maintain their chokehold on hegemonic power. Which means the folks who don't fall into that space can never be redeemed. But to answer the other part of your question, which I think is a really powerful one, what does true redemption look like? I can't really tell you, but I can tell you the first start is nothing less than the destruction, not simply of the physical institutions, but the epistemological structures.
That's right.
The ways that we think.
That's right.
Steve Biko was clear about this, is why they murdered him. If the greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed.
That's right.
And if I limit your horizons, if I tell you your only political options are either Joe Biden or Donald Trump, right? If I limit that, and if I don't ever tell you, we can destroy this system and create another one. We'll never do anything else, and we'll stay trapped in this Manichaean dialectic of always redeemable and perpetually irredeemable, always good and always evil.
And the only thing I want to add to that, because I think this grammar of the human, of civilization, and of progress are really important, is that when one questions any of that and says that we need a new world, even if it's just a speech, let alone if you're fighting for it, you're always going to be a problem. In fact, you might even be a terrorist. You might even get cast as a terrorist.
You become
it's just
evil.
The way it is.
You become evil. Again, these are the things we think about. Tulsa, Oklahoma is a really good example of this. Them black folks wasn't bothered with what the white folks was doing. And they came in and they murdered them anyway. Right. I mean, we have to keep those kinds of things in mind. You don't even have to be actively resisting. You don't even have to be actively fighting back. You don't have to be in the mountains, with your AK-47s or whatever. Right. You can literally say, I'm just going to build me a new world here. The Nation of Islam actually is another good example of this, right? Right. That in certain ways, and the 5%ers who I study are also another good example of this. The 5%ers are unbothered by whiteness, unbothered. They just are trying to create a new logic and a new grammar, and they're institutionalized for being insane. right? So we have to. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is I love this question of redemption. I think myself included. I include myself in this. I don't think we're willing to pay the price for what true redemption would require.
That's right.
That's the sad reality. What we would have to do would be a global mass movement that completely destroys the epistemic, political, and quite frankly, theological horizons within which we find ourselves.
In other words, we have to give up this world.
Yeah. And
we need a new one.
Yeah, and the few benefits that we even derive from this world.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like real shit. I love being a professor. I love teaching. I love teaching all the things. And at the same time, it's a neoliberal institution that is actively, you know what I mean? Like, so we would have to give that up and fight. And I don't know if any of us are really willing to pay that price.
Right.
And so yeah, those are my sort of thoughts.
Very good.
Even though it is apocalyptic,
Mm-hmm.
I think, like, I'm an ethicist, not a political theorist for this reason. I have to do political theory because all ethics is in some way politics. But the apocalyptic scenario that we've given, the truly dystopian world, number one, it's the world in which we live. That's the thing that a lot of people don't understand. That I'm not saying this is where we're headed. We're here now. That's one. But hear me out. We also have modes as the world burns. We have modes of love and care that may not change the world, right? I don't know if we can have a position where the world changes, but that sustain us in these small scale communities.
Yeah.
Like me and Finley are close, right? I care for him, right? And he cares for me. And that matters.
That's right.
So it's as dystopian, as apocalyptic as this picture not simply sounds, but is.
It is.
I hold on I literally hold on for dear life to the moments where I get to throw my hands around Finley's neck. Mm-hmm. Or the moments where I get to, sit with somebody and laugh. Mm-hmm. Watch it. Those things sound hella petty, really small. And we have to find those moments of beautiful love and care.
That's right.
We have to find those moments of holding and being held. Right. That's of utmost importance.
That's an important point to bring this kind of to a close. Those small ways that we can love one another, that we can appreciate the world, even within this context. I love purple flowers. I walk outside, I see purple flowers, it makes me smile. It doesn't mean that the world is any better or any good. And then beyond that, I just try to do what I can for people to make their lives better. That's about all we can do.
It's bleak. I'm not gonna say it's not, but it is what we have. I don't want us to think of this as, there's nothing that can be done. It's bigger. It's bigger than it is. We can do things. And sometimes those things spark fires that create massive movements. So we can't count ourselves out, but we can focus on these smaller scale engagements and start from there.
And we have to. We have to.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.